Gerald Okafor sold the house while she was still sleeping in it, changed the locks on a Tuesday, drained the joint account by Wednesday. By Friday, Nkechi had $200, a suitcase, and nowhere to go. 9 months later, a Forbes Africa journalist walked into her food stall on the corner of Judah Street and ordered fufu. He did not come for the fufu. The morning Gerald changed the locks, Nkechi Okafor was at the Checkers on Commissioner Street buying palm oil. She had been married for 31 years. She had put Gerald through night school when they first arrived in Johannesburg from Enugu in 1993. She had co-signed every lease. She had kept the books for his first courier business, then his second, then the logistics company that finally made real money. She came home at 11:47 a.m. to find a locksmith kneeling at her own front door. "Ma'am, I was hired by the homeowner," the man said without looking up. She stood there holding 2 shopping bags, palm oil in one, onions, crayfish, and a box of Joko tea in the other. She did not drop them. She did not scream. She set them down on the step and called Gerald. He answered on the first ring, as if he had been waiting. "The lawyer will contact you," he said. "I've already filed." That was it. No argument, no negotiation, no 31 years of anything in his voice at all. Just a sentence and a click. Nkechi stood on that step for 9 minutes. She counted them. A neighbor across the street, Mrs. Delamini, watched from her kitchen window, but did not come outside. The locksmith finished, handed the new keys to no one, just left them on the mat, and walked to his van without making eye contact. What Nkechi did not know yet was that Gerald had been planning this for 14 months. He had moved $740,000 from their joint savings into a trust under his brother's name. He had transferred the title on the house in Santon to a shell company registered in Mauritius. He had even changed the beneficiary on his life insurance from Nkechi to Yolanda Price, the 34-year-old brand consultant he had been seeing since a conference in Cape Town. Gerald believed he was intelligent. He believed that intelligence meant anticipating what other people would do and getting there first. His father, Chief Obiora Okafor, had taught him this in their kitchen in Enugu when Gerald was 12 years old. The goat that sees the butcher coming does not wait for the knife. Gerald had carried that sentence like a compass his entire life. It had made him wealthy. It had also made him incapable of trust. But something about the way Nkechi set those shopping bags down would stay with him. He would not understand why until it was far too late. By Friday, Nkechi's lawyer, a referral from her church, a young woman named Adaeze Mbadiwe, who worked out of a shared office on Risick Street, told her the truth plainly. He structured everything to be untouchable before he filed. The house, the savings, the retirement fund, even the car is leased under the company. Legally, you are entitled to a settlement, and I believe we have a strong case for matrimonial property fraud. Realistically, that process will take 18 months to 3 years. And in the meantime, Nkechi asked. Adaeze paused. In the meantime, you survive. Nkechi sat in that office and said nothing for a long time. The clock on the wall behind Adaze's head ticked 11 times before Nkechi spoke again. She had $200 left in her personal account. A suitcase her daughter Chimaka had driven over before Gerald could throw it away. And a notebook, a thick, spiral-bound notebook with a green cover that smelled like ground nut oil and Scotch tape. But that notebook would not matter yet. not for months. For the first 6 weeks, Nkechi stayed with her cousin Blessing Nwosu in a one-bedroom flat in Yeovil. She slept on a foam mattress on the kitchen floor. The mattress had a dip in the center that cradled her hips, and every morning she woke at 4:30 a.m. with the smell of Blessing's coffee mixed with the faint sweetness of overripe bananas on the counter. She walked to the taxi rank on Rocky Street each morning, watching the city come alive, the hawkers setting up their tables, the minibuses coughing diesel and honking at nothing, the women carrying babies on their backs and coolers full of food balanced on their heads. She watched them carefully, not with pity, with recognition. Nkechi had grown up watching her mother, a Daora Williams, cook for money, not in a restaurant. On the side of the road in Ogbate Market in Enugu, Aora had fed construction workers, taxi drivers, and university students 6 days a week for 22 years from a wooden table and a single kerosene stove. Her hands were permanently stained with palm oil and turmeric. Her back was curved from bending over low flames. She never complained about either. Nkechi had sworn she would never do that. She had married Gerald partly to escape it. The smoke, the sweat, the indignity of people walking past your food without looking at you. She had wanted clean hands, an office, a husband who wore cologne instead of wood smoke. She had gotten all of those things. And now, at 55, sleeping on her cousin's kitchen floor, she understood something she had been too proud to see for 3 decades. Her mother had never been powerless. Her mother had fed a neighborhood. Her mother had sent 2 children to university on the back of that wooden table. Her mother had been buried by 400 people who wept not because they had lost a relative, but because they had lost the woman who fed them when no one else would. The indignity was not in the cooking. The indignity was in the way Nkechi had looked away from it. She had been wrong, and now she had no choice but to be right. On a Monday in March, Nkechi took her last $200 and went to the Johannesburg Fresh Produce Market on City Deep. The sun was barely up. The warehouse floors were wet and cold under her sandals. The air smelled like cilantro and diesel and refrigerated earth. She bought 3 bags of cassava, a bag of plantains, a 20-liter container of palm oil, crayfish, stockfish, ground pepper, dried Cameroon pepper, uziza seeds, uhuru, uda pods, ogbono seeds, and a 50-kilogram bag of onions. She borrowed a folding table from Blessing. She borrowed 2 pots, a cast-iron Dutch oven, and a tall aluminum stock pot from a woman at church named Mrs. Ifeoma Easy, who asked no questions and carried them to the taxi herself. She set up on the corner of Judah Street and De Beer Street in Braamfontein, across from the Wits University campus, at 6:15 a.m. The street was still quiet. A security guard at the campus gate watched her unfold the table and arrange the pots. The concrete was cold. The wind came off the Braamfontein Ridge and carried the smell of her palm oil south toward the city center. Her first customer arrived at 7:40 a.m., a security guard named Solomon Adeyemi. He was 6'3", wearing a navy uniform with a name badge clipped to his chest pocket, and he looked at the menu, handwritten on a piece of cardboard leaned against the pot, with suspicion. How much for the fufu? 45 rand. He paid. He ate standing up, using his right hand, leaning slightly forward so the soup would not drip on his uniform. He said nothing while he ate, which Nkechi understood to be the highest compliment a Yoruba man could give Igbo food. He came back the next day, and the next. By day 4, he stopped reading the cardboard. He just said, "The usual, Ma." By the end of the first week, Nkechi had made 1,340 rand. She reinvested every cent. More cassava, more stock. 2 plastic chairs she found at a second-hand shop on Bree Street for 30 rand each. A hand-painted sign on a piece of plywood, Nkechi's kitchen. She would change the name later, but she did not know that yet. By week 3, something strange was happening. People who had never walked down Judah Street were crossing 4 lanes of traffic to reach her corner. A woman from the Department of Home Affairs 3 blocks away started placing lunch orders by WhatsApp. A professor from the WIT Sociology Department brought 6 colleagues on a Friday, and they sat on plastic chairs on the pavement, eating fufu in their blazers. Something was happening on that corner that she had not planned for. The food was extraordinary, not good, not above average, extraordinary. And the reason it was extraordinary wasn't talent alone. The recipes were her mother's. That green notebook, the one she had grabbed from her bedroom before Gerald could discard 31 years of her life, was a Daora Williams's recipe journal. 47 recipes, each one written in her mother's handwriting, in a mixture of Igbo and English, with measurements in pinches and handfuls and, until it smells like this, that Nkechi had spent her childhood memorizing without realizing she was memorizing anything at all. The egusi soup had a depth that commercial restaurants could not replicate because Adaora dry roasted the melon seeds before grinding them. The jollof rice carried a slow burn from a specific blend of Scotch bonnets and dried Cameroon pepper that her mother had perfected through 20 years of daily repetition. The fufu was pounded by hand, not from a box, and Nkechi's arms remembered the rhythm the way a pianist's fingers remember a song they learned at 7. Her mother had been dead for 12 years, but her hands were still cooking. What Nkechi did not know was that someone was already paying attention. His name was Tunde Afolabi. He was 41, Lagos-born, Johannesburg-based, a food and culture journalist for Forbes Africa. He had been writing a long-form feature on the informal food economy of Braamfontein, the women and men who fed thousands of people every day from plastic tables and repurposed coolers, while the formal restaurant industry spent its energy arguing over wine pairings and Instagram lighting. He first noticed Nkechi's stall because of the line. By week 6, there were 17 to 25 people waiting at her corner every lunch hour. Students from WITS in hoodies and sandals. Construction workers from the new mixed-use development on Jorison Street with cement dust on their boots. Office workers from the Braamfontein precinct buildings who walked 4 blocks in heeled shoes and pressed trousers to eat fufu on a plastic chair on a sidewalk. Tunde stood in that line on a Thursday at 12:40 p.m. and watched. He watched Nkechi serve each plate with 2 hands, the way his own grandmother served food, as if the act of handing someone a meal was not a transaction but a transfer. He watched her remember names. He watched her give a double portion to a thin student in a faded WITS hoodie who clearly could not afford the full price. And when the student tried to pay the difference, he watched Nkechi shake her head once and say a single word: "Eat." He ordered fufu and ogbono soup. He sat on a plastic chair on the sidewalk and ate with his hands. The ogbono was unlike anything he had tasted in Johannesburg. The seeds had been toasted, He could taste the nuttiness, the depth, the slow caramelization that most cooks skipped because it added 40 minutes to the preparation. After he finished, he did something he rarely did on a first visit. He went back to the counter. "Ma, where did you learn to cook like this?" And Keiichi looked at him the way she looked at everyone who asked that question, carefully, as if deciding how much of the answer they had earned. "My mother," she said. "Ogbate Market, Enugu." Tunde nodded. "Can I come back tomorrow with a notebook?" "You can come back whenever you want," Keiichi said. "But bring your own chair." He came back the next day, and the day after that. And for 11 days straight, he sat on a camping chair he bought from a game store on Empire Road, eating Keiichi's food and taking notes in a moleskin that smelled like pepper soup by day 3. He did not tell her he was writing a feature. Not at first. What he discovered across those 11 days would dismantle every assumption he had carried into that corner. Here is what Tunde Afolabi documented in his notebook over 11 days at Keiichi's stall on Judah Street. Day 1. Fufu and ogbono soup. The ogbono seeds were toasted before grinding, a technique he had only encountered once before in a documentary about Eastern Nigerian cooking traditions that had been largely forgotten by the formal culinary establishment. The soup had a silkiness that restaurant versions never achieved. Day 2. Jollof rice with fried plantain and peppered chicken. The jollof was cooked in a cast-iron pot over a gas burner, not a commercial stove. The bottom layer, the saka, was served separately to regulars who knew to ask for it. There were 14 regulars that day, each one greeted by name. Day 3. Pepper soup with goat meat and yam. The broth was clear but deeply spiced. He identified uziza, ehuru, and uda, 3 spices that most Johannesburg restaurants had never stocked, let alone understood how to balance. Day 4. Keiichi served a dish not on the menu. Abacha, African salad, made with shredded cassava, ugba, garden eggs, and palm oil dressing. She made it only for a specific customer, a pregnant woman named Chidinma Obi, who had mentioned craving it once, 3 weeks earlier. Keiichi remembered. She had bought the ugba from a specialty shop in Yeovil the previous Saturday, specifically for this. Day 5. He counted the customers. 63 people between 11 a.m. and 2:30 p.m. Average transaction, 52 Rand. Total estimated revenue, 3,276 Rand. From a folding table. Day 6. He noticed the notebook for the first time. Green cover, spiral bound, oil-stained edges. Keiichi consulted it once, quickly, when making a stew he had not seen before. She held it the way his grandmother held her Bible, close to the chest. Pages fanned by memory, more than by fingers. Day 7. He asked about the notebook, Keiichi closed it and set it behind a pot. "That is not for the article," she said. She had figured out who he was by day 4. She had not mentioned it. She had simply kept feeding him. Day 8. He asked again. This time she told him about Adara, about Ogbate Market, about 22 years on a wooden table and a kerosene stove that burned so hot it left a permanent scar on Adaora's right forearm in the shape of a crescent moon. Keiichi did not cry. She spoke the way you speak about a cathedral you once lived inside, with reverence and distance and the quiet knowledge that you will never go back. Day 9. A man in a silver Mercedes-Benz GLE stopped across the street at 1:15 p.m. He did not get out. He watched the stall for 11 minutes through tinted windows. Then he drove away, and Keiichi saw him. Her hands did not stop moving, dishing rice, wiping the counter, adjusting the flame, but her jaw tightened and stayed tight for the rest of the afternoon. That evening, Blessing asked if she was okay, and Keiichi said, "He came to see if I was failing." She did not say who. She did not need to. Day 10. The Mercedes did not come back. Tunda did not ask about it. He understood what silence meant in a woman's face. He also understood by now that Keiichi was not simply a good cook who had fallen on hard times. She was a living archive. Every dish she served carried a technique that had been refined not in a culinary school, but across 2 generations of daily practice, morning after morning, year after year, in a market where the only exam was whether people came back tomorrow. Day 11. Tundi asked Keiichi one final question. What would you do if you had the resources to scale this? Keiichi wiped her hands on her apron. She looked at the line, 22 people deep, curving past the barber shop on the corner. Then she said something that would become the opening line of the Forbes Africa feature. "I don't want to scale, I want to teach. My mother fed 500 people a week from a wooden table for 22 years. She never scaled. She multiplied. She taught 11 women how to cook. Those women taught others. By the time she died, her recipes were feeding 4 neighborhoods in Enugu. That is not a business. That is a root system." Tun put his pen down. He had his story, and it was not the one he came looking for. The Forbes Africa feature ran 7 weeks later. The headline read, "The $200 food stall that's feeding Braamfontein's soul and exposing everything wrong with how we value food." The article was 4,200 words. It was shared 31,000 times in the first 72 hours. It trended on X in South Africa for 2 days. 3 television stations requested interviews, and Keiichi declined all of them. She said she did not have time. What she meant was that she did not want to become a story. She wanted to remain a cook. But it was not the article itself that changed Keiichi's life. It was what the article set in motion. Within 3 weeks, 4 things happened that Keiichi could not have predicted and Gerald Okafor could not have prevented. First, a call from the Wits University School of Hospitality. The head of the program, Professor Lindiwe Kumalo, invited Keiichi to teach a 6-week masterclass on West African culinary traditions, not as a guest speaker, as a visiting lecturer with a stipend of 8,500 rand per session. Keiichi, who had never stood in front of a classroom, said yes before Lindiwe finished the sentence. Second, a partnership offer from a commercial kitchen incubator in Maboneng called the Pot Collective, run by a former chef named Zanele Ndaba. They offered Keiichi a subsidized kitchen space with proper ventilation and cold storage, a business mentor, and access to wholesale supplier networks, in exchange for her agreement to train 3 displaced women per quarter in her cooking methods. Third, a letter. It arrived at Blessing's flat in a cream-colored envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper and a cashier's check for 150,000 rand. The letter read, "Mrs. Okafor, my name is Yolanda Price. You do not know me, and I do not expect your kindness. I was involved with your ex-husband for 2 years. I believed things about him that I have since learned were untrue. I believed things about you that I now know were lies. This money is not compensation. It is not enough for that. It is the amount Gerald told me. he had given you in a divorce. He told me he was generous. He was not. I am sorry. I will not contact you again." Nkechi read the letter 3 times. She folded it and placed it inside the green notebook between the recipe for groundnut soup and the recipe for okra stew. She sat with it for a full day. Then she deposited the check and used every cent of it to do one thing. She went back to the Johannesburg fresh produce market and bought enough supplies to train her first cohort of 12 women, all of them over 40. All of them displaced by divorce or retrenchment or circumstances they did not choose. All of them starting over with less than they deserved. She called the program Adaora's Table. The first class met on a Saturday morning in the Maboneng kitchen. 12 women, 12 aprons, 12 cutting boards. Nkechi stood at the front with the green notebook open on the counter and said one thing before they began. "My mother could not read past primary 4. She could not spell culinary, but she could feed 300 people in a single afternoon and make every one of them feel like the food was cooked just for them. What I am going to teach you is not cooking. It is what my mother taught me, that feeding people is the most powerful thing a woman can do with her hands." Grace Molifi, standing in the back row, wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist and picked up her knife. They started with a goozy soup. They would not finish until 4 p.m. The fourth thing that happened was quieter. On the second Saturday after the article published, Chiamaka drove to Braamfontein and stood in line at her mother's stall. She did not cut the line. She waited 22 minutes. When she reached the front, she ordered fufu and egusi, and Nkechi served her with 2 hands, the same way she served everyone else. They did not hug. They did not need to. Chiamaka ate every grain, then looked at her mother and said, "Grandma would be proud." Nkechi nodded once and turned to the next customer. "You won't believe what happens next. Stay with me." 14 months after Nkechi set up that folding table on Judah Street, Gerald Okafor's logistics company, Okafor Express Logistics, was placed under investigation by the South African Revenue Service for fraudulent trust transfers, undeclared offshore holdings, and unreported income totaling 12.6 million rand. His brother, Emmanuel, who had held the Shell Trust, cooperated with investigators in exchange for reduced penalties and immunity from criminal prosecution. Gerald was not arrested, but the trust was dissolved. The house in Sandton, the one he had stolen while Nkechi was buying palm oil, was seized as part of the asset recovery process. The $740,000 he had hidden was frozen indefinitely. Yolanda Price had already left him. 8 months before the investigation, she had seen, through the Forbes article and through her own growing conscience, exactly who Nkechi was, and by extension, exactly who Gerald was not. Gerald Okafor, at 59 years old, was living in a rented flat in Kempton Park, alone, with a legal defense that was costing him 40,000 rand a month and a reputation that no amount of money could have repaired even if he still had it. The logistics company he had spent 20 years building had lost 3 of its largest contracts within 2 months of the investigation becoming public. His name, which had once opened doors at business dinners and golf clubs across Gauteng, now closed them. He had tried to call Chiamaka. She did not answer. He had tried to call his brother Emmanuel. Emmanuel's lawyer answered instead. The goat that sees the butcher coming does not wait for the knife. Chief Obiora Okafor had been right about that. But he had never told Gerald what happens to the goat that becomes the butcher. Nkechi did not celebrate this. She did not mention his name. When Chiamaka called to tell her about the investigation, Nkechi listened, then said 5 words. "That is his life now." And then she went back to the kitchen and taught a 52-year-old woman named Grace Malefe how to toast ogbono seeds until they release their oil without burning. Grace had been a domestic worker for 19 years. She had hands that knew hard work. She learned in one afternoon what most culinary students took a semester to master, and Nkechi was not surprised. She had learned the same way, watching, doing, remembering. 2 years after that first morning on Judah Street, Adaora's table had trained 61 women. 19 of them had opened their own food stalls across Gauteng. 4 had transitioned into catering businesses. One, a woman named Patience Dube, 48, from Soweto, had been hired as a sous chef at a restaurant in Rosebank after a head chef tasted her pepper soup at a public market event and refused to believe she had no formal training. "Where did you study?" the chef asked. "Judah Street," Patience said, "under a woman who learned from a woman who cooked on the side of a road in Enugu for 22 years. The chef hired her on the spot. 3 months later, Patience's pepper soup was on the permanent menu. The description read, "Inspired by the Williams family tradition, Ogbete Market, Enugu." Patience had insisted on that. Nkechi had not asked her to. The green notebook sat in a glass case at the Pot Collective's Maboneng kitchen, not locked away, displayed. Open to page 17. The recipe for groundnut soup. Beside it, a small brass plaque read, Adaora Williams, Ogbete Market, Enugu, Nigeria, 1971 to 1993. She did not build a business. She planted a forest. Nkechi still cooked, every weekday, on the same corner of Judah Street. The table was no longer borrowed. It was a custom-built stainless steel counter with a hand-painted sign in green and gold that read, Adaora's Table. But she still served on plastic plates. She still remembered names. She still gave double portions to students who could not afford the full price and never once made them feel small for it. Professor Kumalo published a paper in the Journal of African Food Studies titled Oral Culinary Archives: How Informal Knowledge Systems Preserve What Institutions Cannot. She cited Adaora's recipe notebook as the central case study. The paper was downloaded 11,000 times in its first year and was assigned read-in in 3 universities across the continent. Tunda Afolabi's original feature was nominated for the Taco Kuiper Award for Investigative Journalism. He did not win, but the judges noted that his reporting had catalyzed what they called a measurable shift in how South African media covers the informal food economy and the women who sustain it. And on a Tuesday morning in November, Nkechi received a phone call from the University of Nigeria, Nsukka. The Department of Food Science and Technology wanted to digitize her mother's recipe notebook, all 47 recipes, preserved, archived, and made available to culinary students across West Africa. Nkechi said yes. Then she hung up the phone and stood in the kitchen for a long time, pressing the notebook against her chest with both hands. Her mother had died in 2011, 12 years before the phone call. In a hospital in Enugu with no air conditioning on a Tuesday afternoon, holding Nkechi's hand through a phone screen because Nkechi could not afford the flight home from Johannesburg. Adaora's last words to her daughter were not profound. They were practical. The notebook is in the top drawer. Don't let your brother throw it away. He doesn't understand what it is. She had been right. But she had been right about something larger, too. Something she could not have known she was saying. Nkechi Okafor is 57 now. She teaches on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She cooks on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. On Saturdays, she visits Chiamaka in Santon, the same neighborhood Gerald once owned a house in. Chiamaka bought her flat with her own money, a chartered accountant, clean books, no shell companies. Nkechi brings fufu every time. Gerald calls sometimes. Nkechi does not answer. Not out of hatred, out of completion. There is nothing left to say to a man who sold a house while his wife was sleeping in it. The law is handling what the law handles. And the rest, the loneliness, the rented flat, the empty table, the knowledge of what he discarded. That is a sentence no court needed to impose. On the wall of the Mabanang kitchen, next to the glass case, there is a framed photograph, black and white, slightly overexposed. Taken in 1987 by a newspaper photographer who was covering market life in Enugu and stopped because he smelled something he could not identify from 30 meters away. The photograph shows a woman standing behind a wooden table in Ogbate Market. She is wearing a wrapper and a faded headscarf. Her hands are covered in palm oil. She is not smiling. She is working. Behind her, barely visible in the background, a small girl sits on an overturned bucket, watching. Her feet do not touch the ground. Her chin rests on her fists. She is studying every movement her mother makes. That small girl grew up, married a man who promised her clean hands, got him for 31 years, then lost everything and discovered that dirty hands had been the answer all along. Some things cannot be taken, not by lawyers, not by locks changed on Tuesday morning, not by men who confuse ownership with worth. The recipes survive. The knowledge survives. The hands remember what the mind tries to forget. And on the corner of Judah Street, every morning at 6:15 a.m., a woman sets up a table and begins to cook. The line forms before she lights the flame. They are not waiting for food. They are waiting for something that tastes like someone loved them enough to write it down. If someone took 31 years of your life and left you with nothing, what would you rebuild first? Drop your answer in the comments. And if this story reminded you that the things we inherit are not always money, sometimes they are recipes, lessons, or a notebook in a top drawer, share it with someone who needs to hear that. Subscribe. I will see you in the next one.